I wrote this piece originally when I was a teenager. It is called How Goddamned Beautiful a Weak Mind Can Be, a Lament for Purdy. I'm talking about the great Canadian poet. In order to start, as is traditional, I begin with some epigraphs, and of course they are highfalutin. We start with Spinoza, the great Baruch Spinoza, exiled Jew for all eternity, lenscrafter extraordinaire. Here he is, Spinoza. We're talking 17th century. And they say that God has created all things in order, and thus unwittingly they attribute imagination to God. Unless, indeed, they would have it that God, providing for human imagination, disposed all things in such a manner as would be most easy for our imagination. Nor would they find it, perhaps, a stumbling block to their theory that infinite things are found which are far beyond the reach of our imagination, and many which confuse it through its weakness. And here's Gilles Deleuze on his beloved Spinoza, earlier quoted. There is then a philosophy of life in Spinoza. It consists precisely in denouncing all that separates us from life, all the transcendental values that are turned against life. These values that are tied to the condition and illusion of consciousness. Life is poisoned by the categories of good and evil, blame and merit, of sin and redemption. Okay, so my favorite Canadian poet, Purdy. The voice of Purdy is a voice of regions, but not a regional voice. It is a rough voice, but an indelibly poetic one. It connotes barrooms and churches as well as other houses of worship. Indeed, he is just as comfortable with his sloshing pint of dark ale perched atop the bar, kicking over drinks and glass peanut bowls, spouting his poetry at the other drunkards, as he is with giving birth to all manner of towering steeple in that grand fool's mind of his. Purdy is a charlatan and a good old boy, an artist and a laborer, a pauper and a ladies' man. He never carries himself quite like he's being serious, always exuding an element of farce, or at very least performative irony, and always making the most of his absurd, gangly stature, even in his English. To many, the first thing that strikes one about Purdy upon first approaching his work is his sense of humor. His penetrating, inclusive wit that brings together the high with the low, the base with the noble. Much of his humor is based in the working of language grounded in the genitals and asshole. One is reminded of the Arctic dogs who struggle to devour his shit, and the existential dogs with their denial of the self in regards to bitches. All that is done without apology, all that is done without academic distance. This is where poets do grievance and wit. Of course, Purdy is dead, but he would be the first to suggest that he doesn't make anything approximating a goddamn difference, dead or alive. Whatever it is, it never disappears, never stops being, not altogether. It was he that wrote so fervently to resurrect the long-dead memories of the earth, to grant all the ghosts of the Canadian soil a blessed imitation of visibility. Indeed, his words, so like a river, a joke, carrying everything forward indefinitely, translating and changing in speed and time, speeding up towards the center, coursed through the veins of our landscape and resurrected within all that which is our history, all that which lays dormant, making manifest the entirety of time's passage, in all that which it is torn from the walls and hallows of our collective memory. It is not about us. It is about what our older, wiser selves would have been, our wiser earth. Us with the memory of our earth, paling in comparison to its grand assemblages of converging myths and counter-myths, histories and exigencies. Before the body of the earth, we are small and inconsequential, but within us we maintain a sublime connection with the all of nature, and can fortify a relationship with the great, stinking, hilarious cosmos. Suffice it to say, resorting to a final paradox, Al Purdy is a poet of Canada, but no kind of Canadian poet. Al Purdy communicated with the land, however, he was never exhausted by the localized quality of his communication. He saw in each piece of earth its specific chain of half-remembered events, but in each of these events he gave birth to infinite strains, differential lines of potentiality. Each historical moment or lived moment contains within itself a relationship with all other moments. Nothing that lives ever disappears. The river encompasses its indefinability. All of history is in a state of being carried forward, and being carried forward is the historical condition. Purdy's histories, no matter what, always contain within them the traces of all other micro-histories, narrated somewhere in our past, etched somewhere in the memory of the earth, never to be had done with, dwelling, bothering. In many ways, Purdy's most well-respected piece remains Lament for the Dorsets, a poem that provides a seminal and altogether singular embodiment of Purdy's relationship with the earth and his lived pursuing of joy. The Dorsets of the title were Eskimos of the Canadian Arctic whose population were vanquished in the 14th century. Purdy's poem retrieves the memory of the Dorsets from the earth and the ice, and for a moment reanimates their lost history in his generous language. We begin with the image of conjured artifacts, tent rings, spearheads, icons of primitive social bodies inscribed upon the poetry itself by nature, which is itself some kind of god, or, as Purdy writes, spirits of earth and water. We are then confronted with the image of a picture of terrifying old men, so large they broke the backs of bears, so small they lurk behind bone rafters, in the brain of modern hunters, among good thoughts and warm things, and come out at night to spit on the stars. With this contemplation of the first stanza, how can we not already see Purdy's major themes crystallized? We have the Dorsets, conjured anew, with their sacred filiation. Purdy wrote the poem as part of a series of commissioned pieces done on a trip to the Baffin Islands in the Arctic. It is literally by writing about the land itself, placing himself before it, and the act of creation, that Purdy discovers and gives birth to this image of the Dorsets. It is taken directly from the earth and the ice, but he places also the traces of the numinal strain, buried in the unconscious of our history, within the gaps of all those who enter, the gaps of the relations, the gaps of the relations with the land. The Dorsets live not only in Purdy's words, but also, quote-unquote, in the brain of modern hunters, who cover their very tracks, centuries removed, bound by both the virtual and the actual, the unconscious and the earth itself, in process, commingling. The Dorsets are shown to inhabit the brain of the hunter, the modern hunter, coming out only at night, presumably through dreams, the ultimate manifestation of virtuality, to spit on the stars. The Dorsets, having disappeared from the land, abandoned the actual. They're subsumed by the virtual. They become virtual property and territory. Though the dreams of hunters, and though the creative acts of the poem itself, before the ice, before the land, occurring on a virtual and intensive plateau, they're all presenced, free to spit on the stars, to glare into space. In the second stanza, Purdy finally condenses his theme by placing the Dorsets more definitely in terms of their relationship with the process of Earth. The Earth is a body upon which multiplicities of force play out against one another. One cannot control the direction of events on Earth. One cannot conquer death, natural disaster, pestilence. To think quasi-dialectically, to presume a negation of the given, is the ultimate devaluation of Earth and lived experience. The Dorsets affirmed the Earth. Purdy creates in his language a virtual mirror of the nomadic quality of Dorset life. We are presented here with a people who hauled their sleds over the frozen northern ocean. The Dorsets move with the earth instead of against it. They affirm life. It is not surprising in light of this that Purdy goes on in his poem to construct a convergence between the Dorsets and modern man. Indeed, the white man, the so-called civilized man, or as Purdy writes, little men who came from the west with dogs, are each of them looming gregariously on the horizon. These white men. This is combined with the evocation of warm climate cycle, whereby Earth turns on the Dorsets. Here the elements of the Dorsets' extinction become somewhat humorous. Unlike the men from the West with their tools, their permanent settlements, their domesticated animals, the Dorsets seek not an authority over nature, but rather a place of habitation, simply. When the unseasonable weather drives the seals away, Purdy has the Dorsets standing out by the water, staring dumbfounded and scratching their heads, wondering where the hell the seals have gone. And then dying. As simple as that. Since they cannot eat just any sort of thing, they just topple over in all their oafish splendor. In fact, it must be said that the general awkward physicality of the poem and the doggish single-mindedness of the Dorsets have something to do with Purdy and his habit of accentuating his own character. The fourth stanza of the poem redirects the vaguely established configuration of modern man, now placed into a specific context, with the Dorsets. Purdy opens with a humorously macabre and heavy-handed entreaty towards, quote-unquote, 20th century people, apartment dwellers, executives of neon death, war makers with things that explode. We are dealt here a swift inundation of signifiers, corresponding to a sense of life gone amok, to which doubtlessly most of us can relate. Control, fascism, avarice, the rigid, unnatural cityscape itself. Purdy asks of 20th century people the following question. The Dorsets have never imagined us in their future. How could we imagine them in the past, squatting among the moving glaciers 600 years ago with glowing lamps? Everything is restated in these lines. We have the indication of sections of time cut off from one another, the inability to remember properly, either backwards or forwards, anything like an origin. We are cut off from the memory of the earth. However, we mustn't forget the quality of Purdy's question, its tonality, its hidden suggestiveness. How could we imagine them in the past? Well, is that not precisely what we are doing? And more to the point, is not Purdy's poem doing it? Indeed, Purdy has furnished us with a glorious image of the Dorsets atop their immobile glaciers, slowly being swept forward by nature, by the process of earth. It's Purdy's language that is reinvesting in the lived process of these distant peoples something very personal and present. Although they are as remote as trilobites, an actual equivalent for the virtual character of a Dorset soul or spirit, they are nonetheless, though the work of the poet would figure them otherwise, right at our fingertips and more or less the people we already know. Trilobites can be dug out of the earth like Dorsets can be dug out of the mine, however weak. The final stanza, as understated and as elegant as anything in Canadian literature, is a meandering stream of language which, though its very structure and tone are bracing, challenging, recharges all of the central themes and positions them fluidly in the instant of creation as a vaguely fluid center, detemporalized. The place of creation, the thought of the earth itself, perhaps, or maybe just the thought of a dog. The stanza begins by asking of the Dorsets, did they ever realize at all what was happening to them? Did the Dorsets understand the way they lived with the earth and that it would eventually exhaust them, rubbing them off? The poem moves on to an imagined image of the last Dorset, named arbitrarily Kudluk. Kudluk, the last Dorset, sits alone in his caribou skin tent, carving an ivory swan for a dead granddaughter. He is making a gift for his dead granddaughter, and in so doing is affirming the themes of the poem. Although the granddaughter is dead, she is still in some sense there with him, buried in his simple mind, remembered by the earth, and placed somewhere amongst spirits of earth and water. Kudluk constructs these swans, creates creatures of the earth, recreates them, certainly, but hardly creatures of the Arctic, from the virtual artifacts of memory, taking them out of his mind to places in his mind where pictures are, Purdy writes. His art is the task of manifesting the virtual before our eyes, a veritable making actual of the virtual. This is mirrored as well by the business of the poem itself. Kudluk as poet. He gouges parallel lines into the swan, pulled from the pictures in his mind. His point of connection with the memory of Earth itself, holding it with his left hand, bearing down and transmitting his body's weight from brain to arm and right hand. And one of his thoughts turns to ivory. Wow, right? What is to be made of this transmitting? The way it places the brain in equal stead with the arm and right hand. All three are tools of nature, phenomenon or phenomena of equal potency. The brain holds no great transcendental authority. It is merely an effect caused by nature in process. It cannot be divorced, least of all heightened, or risen above the rest of the body, or even the totality of all bodies as they condition and stimulate one another. Kudluk, too, is finally buried by the earth as the snow drifts in around him and covers him like a memory sinking into the fog of the unconscious, dissipated and forgotten, but not abandoned altogether. Kudluk is still part of the story of Earth, and the poet is there to summon him, to cast light on him, to resurrect the form of his many bodies. The poem ends with an affirmation of itself. After 600 years, writes Purdy, the ivory thought is still warm. The warmth of the thought, its life coursing through it, is the gift the poet offers us. An ability to retain all memories of the earth, whether they are verifiable or whether they are not. An ability to cast upon time its character of randomness and the sublime stillness at its heart. Whether Purdy is dead or not, one way or another, the ivory thought is still warm. Becoming extinct means immortality, like being a trilobite or a hieroglyph. And how beautiful a head like Purdy's is. A head much like a dog's head, that is happy as hell with one thought at a time. One thought ever.